Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the invite. But I want to thank Mark and the library folks here for inviting me, and also for just being such a great place to keep storytelling alive. Appreciate it a lot. So, want to hear a tale? I was hoping you'd say that. All right. I wanted to start out. These are going to be stories that are Grimm, but not necessarily from the Grimm book. Is that okay with you? All righty. In Ireland, there's 4 traditional provinces. There's the province of Ulster, which always had the reputation for being a place of martial strength, great courage. The Ulster province was the birthplace of Cuchulainn, who was the Irish Hercules. And then if you go west, the province of Connaught, wild, mountainous Connaught with a rugged coast, beautiful place. That's known as the place of knowledge and of magic. And if you go to Leinster, which is where Dublin is, a lot of wide plains that looks to the east, they say that's the place of commerce and prosperity. And then south is Munster, and they say that's the land of the greatest poetry and music, which in Ireland is saying something, you know. And they say sometimes that in Munster, there's for every shovel for labor, there's 10 fiddles for pleasure. And this is a tale from that southern province of Munster. And years ago, there was a woman who lived there, legendary woman, whose name was Biddy Early. And Biddy Early was a folk healer. She was a teller of tales, but she was renowned because she knew every herb and bark and root and berry that grew all around her. And she knew how to take those things, and she could make them into a libation, a poultice, a concoction, a brew to heal maladies of the body, but also of the spirit. And she was also a bit of a counselor. She would help people live their lives and talk to them. And the people loved her. They deeply trusted her. They came to her from all over the place. The priests hated her because she was such stiff competition, you know. But they say that even priests would come to speak to Biddy Early about their toughest cases to get advice from them, you know. And one day when Biddy Early was as old as dirt, she herself would have said, she was shuffling around in her front room there, and she lived in a little whitewashed cottage. She lived at the edge of the village, had a thatched roof, a simple place. She was in the front room there, and she was sweeping out the front room when a knock came to her door. And she shuffled over, she opened the door, and who was standing right in front of her but Death himself. It was Death, dressed in the long black robe, you know, and he had the scythe, and he was nothing but bones beneath, you know, and he said, "Grandmother, I've come for you. For you know that every person has only so many years and months and weeks, days, minutes, and seconds, and all of yours have come to an end, and you'll be coming with me now." And she said, "Oh, Death, I'm a bit disappointed. I feel fine. I thought I had a few more years left, but I've lived a good life. I've lived a long life. I've seen many beautiful things. I've loved, and I have been loved, and I'll be coming with you, Death, just as soon as I finish sweeping out the front room here, because I'm not leaving a dirty house behind." "Well, Grandmother, I don't think you seem to understand here. I'm Death, and you'll be coming with me now." And she said, "I don't think you seem to understand here something, young man. I've lived a long life. I've always respected the dead, and I would expect a bit of respect from you now. I'm not leaving until I clean the house, and if you were to come in here and help me and stop being such a layabout out there, we might get out of it all the sooner." And Death said, "Oh, bloody hell." Because he knew this was a woman you weren't going to argue with, you know. So didn't Death himself, didn't he come into Biddy Early's house, and he took the broom, and he started fumbling around trying to sweep up there. He wasn't very good at it. Death wasn't used to manual labor of any kind, you know. But he's fumbling around, and after a while, Biddy Early calls from the kitchen. And she says, Death, you're not too good at that, are you? Come in here. Maybe you can make yourself useful here. I want you to take that knife there, cut up those potatoes and these carrots, because I don't want to leave any food go to waste. And I'm making a stew here, you see, so whoever comes to find me will find something cooking for them." And he said, "Oh, Jesus." And he took the knife, but he fumbled around for a while, and after all, she said, "You're not too good at that either. I tell you what, Death, why don't you go out from the kitchen, stand by the front door, because guests are going to be coming soon, you see. It's actually a party tonight, my birthday party, obviously my last birthday party, And I want you to go out there and start welcoming the guests as they come. Says, you want me to welcome the guests? And she said, well, you're no bloody good to me in the kitchen. You can't sweep. Get out there, make yourself useful. So didn't Death himself go to the door, People started arriving for the party. They were coming up the steps and, open the door, and Death would say, welcome. But it was Ireland. People had seen far stranger things than this, And pretty soon the room filled up, and you know how it is. Pretty soon, there were pints being drunk and shots being poured, and people were talking and laughing. Everyone was having a conversation, everyone except for Death. No one really knew what to say to Death, and he was sort of standing in the corner there, But after a while, the food came out. Everybody ate, and then, of course, the birthday cake came out, And after the birthday cake was cut, didn't Grandmother Early's grandson, he's about 5 years old, he brought a piece of cake over for Death. And he said, I brought this for you. It's birthday cake. And Death said, well, I don't eat any longer, I'm Death. The boy said, it's birthday cake. Everybody eats that. It's for my grandmother here. And Death said, oh, bloody hell, all right. And he took it. And he took a bite, but you can imagine what happened. Yeah, him being nothing more than bones. The cake just sort of bounced on his ribs and fell to the ground. But who was noticing that but the children, you see? And pretty soon there was a long line of them all wanting to feed Death. He was a good sport about it. He ate everything they gave him. He drank the punch they served him till there were puddles of that and piles of food at his feet. But then the music started. And pretty soon everybody was up and dancing, it's fiddles and banjos and penny whistles, and people were dancing away and singing. And it might surprise you to know that somebody just wandered over there and invited Death onto the dance floor. And pretty soon Death was dancing as well as he could, and people were dancing with him. And the night went on and on and on. And pretty soon everyone in the whole party there danced with Death, and he danced with them, and on and on it went. And that party was possibly the greatest party Grandmother Biddy Early had ever had, and she'd had a number of them. It lasted longer than any party she had, but finally the time came for the party to end, and she and Death bid farewell to all the guests, and they went out the door, and she closed the door, and she turned back to Death, and she said, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being patient with me, and for letting me have my last party. And I'm ready to go with you, Death. I'm ready to go now. And didn't she put her hand out to him? And he put that bony, cold hand out to her, and he said, Grandmother, I can't remember when I've had such a fine time. I rarely get invited to parties, let alone having people dance with me, you see. Why don't I come for you next year at this time? And we'll see if it's time for you to go then. And she said, well, Death, whatever it is that you want. No, that would be fine. That would be fine. So didn't Death himself leave, but he came back a year later. But you see, that year was pretty much like the first year, except for the fact that he was a little better at sweeping and cutting up the vegetables, The fact of the matter is, those parties are still going on to this day. And the fact of the matter is, the people of that village are known as being kind and generous and compassionate and wise, a bit weird. And some would say, well, it's all because perhaps we all dance with Death on a rather regular basis, and he dances with us. And although he's certainly not the most graceful of dancing partners, he's certainly no one that we're afraid of. That's what they told me. But they wanted me to tell all of you, there is another party coming up real soon, and all of us are invited. That's Grandmother Biddy Early Meets Death. Thank you. The Irish have a lot of tales around death. Every culture does, Usually the things that are toughest to deal with in life, we put stories around. So we have some way to deal with them, to work with them. And in Ireland, there's a great famous storyteller. He's a Shawnachie. A Shawnachie is a traditional teller of tales. A Shawnachie knows all the old stories and often travels around. And one of the most famous ones is still alive. His name is Eddie Lenihan. He has a beard about that long. And he's sort of a specialist in researching and finding tales of the fairy folk or the wee folk or the good folk, as they're sometimes called. And there are thousands of stories. And many of them are very, very, very scary. I made the mistake of buying his book, which was called Meeting the Other Crowd, and taking it with me on a solo camping trip to the John Day River. You know? Not a good idea, you know. Every time the wind blew, it's like, oh, God, what was that? You know, they're coming for me now. You know? And this is one I highly recommend, the book called Meeting the Other Crowd. Very readable, but also interesting in terms of Irish history and folklore. And Eddie Lenihan became famous for a while in the States because in the 1990s, he was written up in the New York Times. The government of Ireland was going to build a big throughway, a big highway, and it was going to come through a certain place where it was going to go right through a fairy mound. Fairy mounds are raised places of earth. They're like circles, raised circles of earth. There's usually hawthorn bushes growing nearby, and they're considered sacred places, entrances and exits of the wee folk, the fairy folk. And he protested and got thousands of people along with him to say, you're not putting your frickin' road here, all right? You just move it over there. And they're, really? Why? It's just, and they did it, right? And I thought, there's an interesting character, you know. So this is one of Eddie Lenihan's tales. He says, what is it really that makes us shudder? What is it that puts a shiver down our spine? Some people would say it's nothing other than nearness to the other side. Now, there are places in the earth that are very thin. The veil between this world and the other world is very thin. There's also times in the year when the veil is very thin. Halloween is one of those. Samhain, the Irish people call it. And we know such places because sometimes they're called haunted places. Some people call them holy places. But whatever you call them, everybody knows those are places in which you should have a care. And in Ireland, you can see many of those places because they're raised pieces of earth, sometimes as big as this room, sometimes much smaller. Usually hawthorn bushes are growing there. And those are the denizens of the entrances to the fairy forts where the wee folk live. Now, in case you're thinking that the fairy folk are nothing more than a bunch of sprites flitting around on transparent wings, casting a boon here and a blessing there, you've got another guess coming. We give them names like the wee folk, the fairy folk, the good people, to help us forget the many malicious and malevolent deeds they have done and will do. For if respected, if given their due, if left to themselves, we've nothing to fear from them. But if ever they're crossed, even if inadvertently, there is no creature upon this earth quite so imaginative, quite so gruesome, and quite so dedicated to getting its due than the fairy folk. And there are none that know that better than the people of the village of Shanaglash. It was not long after the famine times where so many had died of the hunger, and then later of the cholera. And you see, the town of Shanaglash, among those who died, was the village weaver. Now that was no small thing, because in those days, you see, you didn't just go into a shop and buy a suit of clothes. No, you went to the weaver. Because in those days, of course, you had to spin the yarn, and then you had to weave cloth, and then you had to cut out the cloth and sew it up into a suit of clothes, and the weaver was your man for all of that. And now with the weaver dead there in Shanaglash, didn't the people have to walk 5 miles to Gort just to get a suit of clothes? Well, they did until one day some of the men were working in the high field there in Shanaglash, and they looked down and they saw a man coming down the road with a pack on his back. They were afraid of him. You were afraid of any stranger then, because he could be bringing the disease, the cholera. And they cried to him and said, "Man, you there, where are you going?" And he looks up and he says, "Well, I come from up north, but there's no work up there. I came to see if I might find work here to ply my trade." "What trade would that be?" "Well, I'm a weaver." Well, that was enough said. They let him come in and open a shop. And they found out pretty soon that the man they had as their weaver was nothing more than a fledgling journeyman, for this one was a master at his trade. He was excellent, and in no time at all, he had a long line of people out the back of his door. He had a lively trade. He made a good coin at it. But this man, this weaver, he was a countryman. He'd been from rural places, and he went casting about just looking for a plot of ground to grow some spuds, a cabbage or two. But everyone he asked, they'd said, "Oh, sorry, man, there's not much ground around here, nothing for rent, you see. All our plots are small. We'd help you out if we could, but we can't." He said, "Really? There's no one that could rent me just a small plot of ground." Well, if anyone could do that, it would be the man up on top of the hill there. That's Murphy. He's got the better part of 60 acres. He might be able to set some free for you. Well, Murphy had 60 acres, but he was a conniving sort and tight with a coin. But the next day, didn't the weaver go up there, knocked on the door? Murphy answers it. He says, "I'm casting about just to find a plot of ground to grow a few spuds." And Murphy says, "Well, I might be able to find you a piece of ground, but you'll be paying in gold, and there won't be any refunds." And the weaver says, "I have no trouble with that." He gives him the pouch of gold, and the weaver knows that he has him now. He takes the gold, he takes him round back, walks up on top of the hill. He says, "Well, here's the plot you can have." There's a fairy fort right in the middle of it. Raised mound of earth, hawthorn trees growing around there. And he knows that no Irishman in his right mind is going to plant anything in a spot like that. But the weaver, he says, "Well, if that's the ground you got, that's the ground I'll take." And Murphy thinks surely he's bluffing. But the next day, doesn't he come up with a wheelbarrow and a bunch of seed spuds, you see? People found out what he's doing, they come up with him. And he goes out there right in the middle of the field with an axe and the shovel. And he's just about to lay right into one of the hawthorn bushes, and someone calls out, "Weaver, man, we usually let places like that be around here." Someone else says, "Weaver, that's right, man. You know, the fairy folk, they have little enough left to them. And they have a bit of a penchant for revenge as well." Someone else says, "Waiver, just let it be, let it be. We'll get the money back for you, Waiver, let it be." And he says, "Anyone else want to say anything? Are you all done?" Fairy folk, is it? Where I come from, we don't believe in that nonsense any longer. But I tell you what, if the fairy folk come for me, I'll take the spade, take the skin right off of their backs. Now let me work. And they watched. As he picked up an axe, he just laid right into the hawthorn. And then he took the dirt and cast it this way and that until the mound was leveled. And on he worked planting the spuds, and the people, they just shook their heads and made their way down the hill. Well, he got the spuds planted. Didn't he go home that night, smoke his pipe, proud of himself after a good day's work well done? Summer came. Sun rose, set, moons waxed and waned, and all summer long the people were much more interested in the weaver's plot than their own. And every day, didn't they wait for some evil to befall him, for some tragedy? But none did. In fact, the exact opposite happened. You might know, if you've ever planted spuds, that a good bush is going to be maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. By the middle of the summer, the weavers were 6 and 7 feet high. Finally, autumn came, you see. It was time to harvest. He came up with a wheelbarrow. The whole town came with him. They're all in a big circle there around the plot. And doesn't the weaver go out, big as life, with a shovel now? He puts it into the ground to pry up a spud, to pry up a... Says, Jesus. He pushes down, he can't. And finally, he stands on the haft of the shovel, and he levers up a spud that's as big as a pumpkin. Beautifully formed as well. Well, hasn't he shown these folk a thing or two? He picks it up, puts it in the wheelbarrow, and goes on to the next one. Now, if you've ever harvested spuds, you know it's impossible to do that without cutting into one of them. Sometimes that'll happen. And finally, the weaver, he cut into one with the shovel and pulled it out, and a woman shrieked because the shovel, the spade, was covered in blood as red as your own heart's blood. The people just crossed themselves, walked down the hill, but the weaver just continued on. He thought it might be some strange variety of potato. He picked as many as he could up, made his way down the hill, up and down all day long. Smoked his pipe, went to sleep. It was, they say, about 11 the next morning. There was a man out in front of the weaver's place there. It was a customer, a client, knocking on the door, pounding on the door. There was no answer. And a neighbor walked by and said, trouble there, what is it? And the client says, well, I walked over from Gort today. He said he'd meet me at 11, but he's not here. And the neighbor says, that's not like the weaver. No, he's always there when he says he'll be there. Have you looked around back? They did that, nothing. The neighbor called out, Weaver, are you in there, man? Strange. He opened the latch of the door, pushed it open just a little bit, and as soon as he did, oh, Jesus, the smell that came out of the house. Both the client and the neighbor put their kerchiefs over their noses there. He opened the door and says, Weaver, are you there, man? No one in the front room, no one in the kitchen. But it was the bedroom. They walked over to it and slowly opened the door. And the neighbor looks, oh, Jesus. If the people of the village of Shanaglis had been waiting for some evil, some tragedy to befall the weaver, they didn't have to wait any longer. He was laying on the bed, but it looked like a bolt of lightning had shot through him. His arms and legs were contorted and twisted, convulsed in every conceivable way. His head was thrown back. You could only see the whites of his eyes. His tongue was stuck out, but he was still breathing. He was alive. He heard the men come in the door, and he cried out. They came over to him. As they tried to stretch him out, he was in such pain. But they stretched him out, put a pillow behind his head. The neighbor came over to him, put his hand on his head. He said, Weaver, and as he did, all the skin came off his forehead. He said, Jace. He told the client, go run, get the priest. The priest came, he took the oil and did the sign of the cross on the weaver, and as he did, more flesh came off. The priest said, there's nothing I can do. Take him to Gort, take him to the poorhouse there. A doctor comes to visit. They put him in the wagon, and the men of Shanaglis, they took the weaver, made him as comfortable as they could. They took him to Gort, where there was a poor house. They bathed him, but the smell of him, the stench of him was so bad. They couldn't put him in a room. They put him beneath a staircase on a mattress there. A young girl, a country girl who worked there, tended to him. She came to feed him that night. But when she went to give him food, he was already chewing on something. 'Twas his teeth. They'd all fallen out. She went to bathe him, and every time she did, off came flesh and hair. The next morning, she went to find him. All the nails had come off his fingers and toes. He didn't last that day. The men of Shanaglis came for him. They put him in the wagon. They took him. And the next day, all gathered around the cemetery. They buried him well, and all the songs were sung and all the prayers were said. Now, no one said a word, but wasn't everyone thinking the same thing? Here lies the weaver of Shanaglis, the very man who was going to take the skin off the fairies' backs. But didn't they take his instead? His skin, his hair, his nails, his teeth, until they had taken his very life. For the fact of the matter is, if they're respected and given their due, there's nothing to fear from the wee folk. But if they are crossed, even if inadvertently, there is no creature on this earth quite so imaginative, so gruesome, and so dedicated to getting its due than the wee folk. And there are none that know that better than the people of Shanaglis. Now, how many fairy forts do you think were disturbed in and around Shanaglis after that time? Not a one. And if you don't believe me, well, you could do your own inquiring. Thank you. Let's clear the palate a little bit with a song, and we'll do something a little different. Singing with me, you don't have to be in tune. The most important thing is volume and enthusiasm, okay? And that's something the Irish believe, that there's very few things that you can't improve with volume and enthusiasm, you know? And so just sing. If you don't know the words, or you lose a line, just sing louder, okay? And so this is an old folk tale called Merry Mack, right? And I want you guys to help me with the chorus. Very simple. It goes like this. Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. Well, I'll be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. Ring die diddle 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 dum. Have you got it? Yeah. Already? All right. Mark, we should be serving pints at this point. You know, it would help. Now, there we go. And we should have convened at the bar, you know. Well, I'll break it down a little bit for you. It'll be easier to do. I'm just going to sing Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. And you just roll back to me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Can you try that? My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Good. And I'll sing, gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. And we'll all sing, we'll all be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. Want to try that? We'll all be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. Good. All right. So the verse is, there's a nice wee lass, and her name is Merry Mack. Make no mistake, she's a girl I'd like to take. A lot of other chaps would like to follow on her track, but I'm thinking that they'll have to get up early, 'cause Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. We'll all be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. It's good if you sing it together, too. That works also. You know? Now this sweet lass, she has a lot of gas, has a lot of brass, and her father thinks I'm class. I'd be a sorry ass for to let the matter pass. Her father thinks she suits me very fairly. So Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. We'll all be making Merry, Merry Mack. Mary and her mother go an awful lot together. In fact, you hardly ever see the one without the other, and people wonder whether it's Mary or her mother, or the both of them together that I'm courting. Well, Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. We'll all be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. Well, the wedding's on a Wednesday, and everything's arranged. Her name will soon be changed to mine, unless her mind is changed with making the arrangements. I'm just about to arrange a marriage is an awful undertaking. Well, Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. We'll all be making merry when I marry Merry. One more verse. Well, it's sure to be a grand affair, and grander than a fair. There'll be a coach and pair for rich and poor, and every pair that's there will dine upon the finest fare. I'm sure to get my share, and if I don't, then I'll be very much mistaken. So Merry Mack's father's making Merry Mack, marry me. My father's making me Merry, Merry Mack. Gonna marry for my Mary to take care of me. We'll all be making merry when I marry Merry Mack. Give yourselves a hand. Good stuff. I love myths and traditional tales, and Joseph Campbell, a great mythologist, once said something that I really liked, which was a myth is a story that's not true, that attempts to tell the truth better than the truth could tell. Right? And if that's not confusing enough, I'll give you another definition from a 5th grade boy. I did a week-long session in mythology for his class, and after the week I said, can anybody tell me what is a myth? And silence, one hand goes up. Yeah, Tim. Mr. Hornyak, a myth is those stories you tell that aren't true, that keep happening again and again and again. Right? So he put his finger right on it. It's a paradoxical tale. On one hand, it's not true. On the other hand, it points to a pattern in human existence that recurs again and again and again and again and again. And this is one of those, a favorite one of mine. It comes from the Arthurian legends, a great source of material. But one day, it was actually this time of year in the autumn, King Arthur was out hunting. He loved to hunt. Any hunters here? Elk hunters, deer hunters? No? Okay. They're all out hunting right now. What would they be doing here? Naturally. Arthur was hunting, and he went thundering through the woods upon his steed. But he stopped at one point. He looked up, and he saw a stag. But it arrested his attention because it was a stag with silvered antlers. He'd never seen a creature that was so magnificent. And the king immediately was after it. And all day long, he chased the stag, and at times it would stop, almost waiting for him. And just at moments when he thought he had lost its track, he would look, and he could see a hoof print, or he'd hear a flushing of birds and knew that the stag had passed nearby. And hour after hour, he finally tracked the stag to a wide heath, a meadow, ringed by these ancient gnarled oak trees that sort of darkened the sky, and by now it was dusk, twilight, which is the time that's neither here nor there, and when all the cool stuff happens in fairy tales, right? And he was there, and he saw the stag. It was in the middle of the meadow. And finally, he had a clean bow shot. So he knocked an arrow to his bow. He drew it back when the mist rose from the ground, shrouded the stag. And all of a sudden, this voice came from the woods, and the voice said, "Arthur, 'tis my stag you're hunting. 'Tis my woods in which you're trespassing. And now, from your shoulders, your head will roll." And the king turned to see this enormous ogre, a 12-foot tall man, come out of the woods with a razor-sharp broadsword. And he said, "You're trespassing, your head is mine." And the king got on one knee. He said, "Great ogre of the woods, please, I didn't know. I thought these woods were mine. And look, all I have is a bow and an arrow. I have no sword. At least give me one chance." And the ogre said, "Well, I'll make you a deal. If you can answer one simple question, you're free to go. But if you can't answer my question, you must agree that your head and kingdom belong to me." And the king said, "Let me get this straight. If I can answer a simple question, I'm free to go. If I can't, my head and kingdom belong to you." "That's right." "Well, I'm not really in a very good bargaining position right now, so." "All right, what is your simple question, great ogre of the woods?" He says, "It is this. What is it that women most desire?" You're calling that a simple question, are you, ogre? You don't need a bit of time to answer that. I need a lot of time. And the ogre said, "I'll give you a year and a day." And he jumped on his horse, and he traveled all the way back to his castle. Now, can you give me some hoofbeats? It's very important. This is an ancient oral tradition called keeping the bloody audience awake. It's very important, okay? And he thundered back, and the doors opened, and the people cried out, ready? "The king returns."
The king returns.
And he found his wisest advisors. They were at the Dallas Library. "Hello, wise advisors. It's good to see you. I'm glad your mentor, Mark, brought you here. Now, wise advisors, I pay you well, let you come to great programs here in Dallas, but I need wisdom once in a while. I met an ogre in the woods. He's going to take off my head, take our entire kingdom, unless I can answer the question, what do women most desire? So, what should I do?" And they pondered. Can you do those pondering motions? Good pondering. And then they reflected. Good. Then they wondered. And at last, it's a very thoughtful group. I like that. At last, altogether, they had an aha experience. I'm taking you guys on the road. This is good. Okay? And here's what they said altogether. They said, ready? "Send the knights out.
Send the knights out.
Ask every woman
Ask every woman
what she most desires.
what she most desires.
Make a list.
Make a list.
One should be right."
One should be right.
Thank you, wise advisors. Something a committee would come up with, it sounds like, right? So the king took their advice, and the next day he sent all the knights of the realm out riding through the realm. Now, remember the names of some of the knights of the round table? Sir Galahad, Sir
Lancelot.
all the women remember him. Sir Lancelot, yes. Sir Circumference, inventor of the round table. Exactly. I'm glad you said that. I was going to say that, but And among the knights was among the bravest, the wisest, the most loyal, and definitely the most handsome, Sir Gawain, kind of like this guy here. Could you play Sir Gawain for us? Could you play Sir Gawain for us? It's really easy. Can you come up? Yeah. You decided to sit in the front row. I just had to do it.
This would be a bad mistake. Splash.
Can you ride through the realm a little bit? Yeah, excellent. Very good. Very good. Very good. Trained at the Monty Python School of Writing, like so many of us. Very good. And he thundered through the realm. You need those coconuts, right?
Yes, exactly.
Now, Sir Gawain thundered through the realm, but whenever he came to a woman, and it mattered not if it was a princess, a pauper, a washerwoman, a queen, he would get off his horse and he would bow nobly. Can you bow nobly, Sir Gawain? Oh. And he would inquire, "What is it you most desire?"
What is it you most desire?
Now, women of this realm here tonight, what do you think the women of that realm might have said? What do women most desire?
Love.
Love. Can you write that down, Sir Gawain? Excellent. Respect.
Diamonds.
Beauty. Diamonds. Accessories. What was that? Gold.
A man.
A man.
To do the dishes.
To do the dishes. Oh, good. Yeah, get that last part in there. Right? What else do women most desire? I had a fourth grader say a couple years ago, a perfect kiss.
Fourth grader.
Yeah. Happiness. Some women said, oh, Sir Gawain, what we most desire is to have a brave, loving, kind, generous, strong, emotionally available, and preferably extremely wealthy husband. And others said, no. What we desire is to be rid of the husbands that we have. They do nothing for us, you see. And some said, sonny, just to have somebody come by the bloody hut and say hello, that would be nice. And some of the maidens at Camelot said, darling, you should talk to Lancelot. He knows exactly what you like. And every woman had a different reply. So the knights, being wise men, they wrote every reply down. But in those days, of course, they had sheepskin, vellum, pounded calf skin, that kind of stuff. And King Arthur needed 5 horses to carry those all back to face the ogre. And the great Sir Gawain returned to the castle. Let's give him a hand. He'll be back, though. And the ogre appeared and said, all right, king, are you ready now? Tell me, what is it women most desire? And the king began to read, He said, money, diamonds, respect, happiness, a man to do the dishes, a pony, shoes, a pony, and a man to do the dishes. No man, shoes, and a pony, and gold. No? He read for 5 hours. And the ogre said, they're all wrong. And if you don't know by sunset, which is in about 10 minutes, your head and kingdom are mine. And now the king truly did not know what to do. And he was wandering around in the woods. He came to a place in the woods he'd never been to before in his own realm. He didn't know this place. And it was there that he saw a hag coming towards him. Now, a hag is an extremely powerful woman. And a hag can assume many shapes. A hag can be as gentle, as fecund as a summer's day. She can be as horrifying, as destructive as a hurricane. A hag can bless your life. She can be a boon to your life. She can curse your life. She can destroy your life. And on this particular day, this particular hag assumed this particular shape. She had a hump on her back, which was so big she would have fallen on her face, but fortunately her nose had grown so long, it sort of kept her propped upright that way. And the king saw upon her nose there was a wart, so bulbous and big it was able to house another wart, which in turn housed another wart. From the topmost wart there sprang 3 black hairs that grew about 6 feet in each direction. She was not a comely lass. But she said to the king, well, this is Arthur, the great king. You don't seem to carry your proud, noble, arrogant manner today. Something troubling you. And the king said, well, nothing much troubles me. I'm the king. But I am about to lose my head and kingdom in about 10 minutes, unless I can answer the question, what do women most desire? Oh, really? You can't answer that. It's plain as day. You know the answer? Of course. Well, then tell me. Oh, I will. For a small price. Don't worry, nothing much. Just the hand of your bravest, most handsome, dreamy knight, that loyal Sir Gawain, in marriage to me. Now, the king knew Sir Gawain would do anything for him. Good, yeah. Yes, no, you can stay there for now, but yeah. And so he said, I promise you, because it's not just my life, but the whole realm is at stake, if you can answer the question, save my life in the kingdom, you can marry the great Gawain. She said, good, come here. And he bent down and she whispered the answer right into his ear. She whispered this. She whispered, you want to know what she whispered? Okay. She whispered something he'd never, ever heard before. And he heard it. He said, that's absurd. He said, that's ridiculous. He said, but that might work. And he ran back. The final rays of the sun fell upon the meadow, and the ogre said, one more chance. Answer in truth, or thy head and kingdom are mine. What do women most desire? But the king knew the answer. And he looked the ogre right in the eye, and he said, ha ha. You want to know what he said? He said, exactly what the hag whispered to him. That's what he said. And when the ogre heard it, he said, you meant my sister, didn't you? Only she knows the answer to that question. And her head's going to roll when I find her. But you've answered correctly. A deal's a deal, a bargain a bargain. You're still the king, I'm the ogre, and you're free to go. And he jumped on his horse. This is your part again. Ready? Roll it all the way back. And the doors opened and the people cried, "The king lives!" The king lives! And all were merry, all were glad, all celebrated, save one man. But 3 months later, the wedding day came. Honey! Oh gosh, wow, couldn't you dress up just a little more for the wedding? I mean, I know it's Northwest casual and everything, but God, would you come from the logging show or what?
I was working in the cemetery.
It was more of a funeral than a wedding. They tried to make the hag look more presentable, but remember the nose hairs? Yes. Too thick to be clipped with shears or cut with a sword, so white ribbons were tied to them instead. During the ceremony, the birds, which had nested in her hair, it was excellent habitat over the decades, they sort of flitted in and out from beneath the veil. It was their home, after all. Only pity accompanied the two as they made their way up the steps to pass their first night together. You just wanted to come to a library and hear a story, right?
Part of one.
And they stopped in front of the bedroom door, and she turned to her husband and said, "Now, honey, how about a kiss? A real kiss." Well, he peered into the gaping mouth of his wife, which was guarded by these two enormous teeth, which sort of crossed each other at the bottom there. And he bent down, but he swerved at the last moment and just managed to land a little peck on her cheek. And she said, "Honey, if you fought your battles the way you kiss, we would have been conquered long, long ago. Come on, I want a kiss." Well, what could he do? What could she do? What can any of us really do? The great Sir Gawain put his arms around his bride, drew her to him with all his heart, his soul, his passion, his being. Oh, he kissed her. And we're definitely going to use our imagination for that part. Okay? Whew. But when they finished, she said, "Honey, that was lovely. Let's go in there." And they went into the bedroom, and she sat on the bed, and he changed into his night clothes, which looked a lot like what he wore for the wedding, actually. He had kind of a theme going. And he went over, and he sat on the bed, and he turned to his bride, and he was amazed. He said, "She looks a bit different."
She looks a little different.
Yeah. One of the nose hairs had fallen off, and her hump, remember the hump? It was gone, which was especially fortuitous. It allowed her then to lay down on the bed, you see. And he looked at her again, and he noticed again she had changed. And he said, "There's no birds flying around her."
There's no birds flying around you, dear.
And he laid down on the bed. He turned to her a third time, and now there was no hag at all. There was a rather lovely woman there, and he inquired of her. He said, "Anywhere?"
Have you seen my wife anywhere?
She said, "Gawain, darling, that's me. But let me tell you how matters stand with me. You see, my husband, long ago, I was put under a spell. And even though I was among the wisest, most powerful of all the women in the entire realm, I was made to live in the deep and the dark and the tangle of those woods. But you, by kissing me with all your heart, all your being, all your soul, every ounce and bit of your passion, you have managed to break half the spell." That's
Half
right.
the spell.
Yeah, you're not that good. And so I can be this beautiful maiden for half the day, and then the other half I need to be, "Wow! Remember me?"
Yes.
So, darling, my question is this. Should I be the beautiful maiden during the day and the hag at night, or the beautiful maiden at night and the hag during the day?
Oh, jeez.
Exactly. That's exactly what Sir Gawain said way back then. And then he thought for a long time. He pondered, he mused, he reflected, he wondered, he did a cost-benefit analysis in an ancient version of an Excel spreadsheet. And finally, he couldn't think any longer. He could not think any longer. And it was at last his heart that answered. And he simply turned to his bride, and he said to her from his heart, "Whatever you most desire,
Whatever you most desire,
do that.
do that.
You're free to choose.
You're free to choose.
I would love you either way."
I will love you either way.
And she said, "Sir Gawain, you've just broken the rest of the spell. And my husband, I am now free to do whatever it is that I want to do. And I have always wanted to be beautiful during the day. The day, the day, the day, the day. Oh, and the night, too." And so she became beautiful day and night because that was her desire. And it was then she told Sir Gawain what it was. As a hag, she whispered to the king, which is what the king shouted to the ogre, which is what had saved his life, not to mention the realm, which was the answer to the question, what do women most desire? The right to make up their own bloody mind. And you know what? If they don't have that, things are going to get very, very ugly. They did the wedding all over again. They feasted for a year and a day. I know, I was there. I told stories for about 3 months. But then I had to leave to get here to Dallas to tell you the bloody story. But from that wedding, I brought a great libation that they served there and was prepared to serve some of it to you tonight.
All right.
But as I walked over here, Mark called my name, and I don't know about you, but when Mark calls, I listen. I turned, I tripped. The ceramic vase there, holding that beautiful libation, it went up into the air, came down, fell upon concrete, and I'm sure most of it's in the Yamhill River by now. So all I got is a story, and it's pretty much gone the same way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's called the Marriage of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell. How many have heard that story or versions of it before? Some people have. I tell that sometimes in middle schools, and of course halfway during the story, the teachers are going, "Where is he going with this?" But we don't go into the bedroom in the middle schools. We just stay out in the hallway. But anyway, when I finished the story, I said, "Anybody ever heard this before?" And the kids say, "You got that from Shrek." Right. Yeah, those old English bards, you know, they got it from Shrek, you know. But it's an interesting story. I've researched that story a little bit and found out that scholars and historians tell us that that story actually might have been written 900, 1000 AD, but it became very, very popular throughout the courts of Europe in the 12 and 1300s, you know. And it's interesting, that was the same time when lots of cathedrals were being built in Europe in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was also the time of courtly love, romance, and chivalry, you know. And so they began to ask the question, what would it be if women actually had a place in society more so than just property? What if women, right, actually had what they wanted and needed? What would a world like that be like? Now, of course, women had very little political power. They couldn't own property. But we often try to introduce difficult ideas or new ideas into the consciousness of society through arts, poetry, storytelling, theater, today, movies. And that was an early attempt to at least ask the question, what do women most desire? And for a couple centuries, that story was told everywhere. Now you can imagine in those days, people would not just tell the story, but there were great storytellers that would tell that story over perhaps an hour and a half period. People would come and play the parts. And then, of course, everybody could understand and get the narrative of the story, but later on they would sit around and discuss, what does it mean, right? Because as Robert Bly, a great storyteller, used to say, in those days you didn't have psychology, but you had mythology, right? And mythology was a doorway into the psyche. So people could sit around and say, wow, what does that mean when the king had to get lost in his own kingdom? What's that mean? What does that actually mean to embrace the hag? Something that seems so offensive in one hand, but on the other hand, it's like she turns the tide. And on the other hand, too, when something is actually loved and embraced, the very nature of it changes, right? So these were ways of thinking about things and opening up ideas and getting people talking. And of course, in the 12th and 13th century, during the Dark Ages, there weren't many cities and, you know, cultural places where you could go. And so troubadours and storytellers and musicians traveled from place to place where they could put on shows like that. So I thought I would tell you a tale. Well, let's see. It's not a Grimm story. It's one of the stories that I love to tell the most. It's a story actually about Greeks, but written by the great Roman poet Ovid in about 300 AD. And Ovid said that long ago, a king sent a rider to a small village. And the rider said to all the people, prepare yourselves. The king is coming to visit here. And the people in that village had never seen the king. And this was going to be quite an event. So they were busy preparing the village for the coming of the king, and a feast was made, and banners were unfurled, and the gardens were cleaned, and the whole town was adorned. All waited for the coming of the king. And the day before he arrived, there were two travelers, common travelers, who wandered into town, and they wore tattered, dusty robes. One was a rather big man, and these two travelers, these strangers, came to each and every cottage of that village. They knocked on every door, and people would answer the door, and they would say, yes, yes, what is it? And the older traveler often spoke. He said, well, we've traveled long and far. We seek a roof over our head, a morsel of food. For that, we'd be happy to compensate you. But all the villagers said, well, I'm sorry, the king is coming. Don't you know that? Haven't you heard? And there's much to be done, and there is no room, and I'm sorry, but goodbye. They went to each and every cottage, and everywhere it was the same. The king is coming, there's much to be done, I'm sorry, and goodbye. And at the end of the day, with the final rays of the sun falling on a hillside, they walked out of the town, they walked a couple miles, and they saw what was their final hope. It was just a tiny hut with a thatched roof, but there was a well-tended garden beside it, and a little creek that flowed in the back, and they knocked on that door. And this old door creaked open, and there behind it there stood a woman whose hair had long ago turned gray, but her eyes were so bright, so alive, and so welcoming. And she said, yes, yes, what is it? And the older traveler, he repeated his familiar litany. You know, we've traveled long and far. We seek a roof overhead, a morsel of food. We'd be happy to pay you. And she said, you needn't do that. My husband and I would love to have you. Come in, come in, come in, come in, come in. And this old woman, her name was Baucis. She immediately brought two strangers right into her house, sat them down in these crude chairs, and immediately brought them goblets of wine made from her own grapes. And while they were eating, or drinking that wine and warming themselves beside the fire, she called to her husband. She said, Philemon, bring in vegetables from the garden. We have guests this evening. And in no time at all, an old man came in with an armload full of potatoes and carrots. And the two, Baucis and Philemon, the old woman, the old man, they made a meal for these perfect strangers. And while they were eating, Baucis and Philemon gathered fresh straw and put that on the floor, and they put blankets on the straw, and they made a crude bed there, and that is where they slept that night. They said, you take our room, that will be much more comfortable. And these two strangers, they slept the best night they'd slept in months. And they awoke late. They awoke to bird song, they awoke to the sun on their faces, and they awoke to the sounds of Baucis, the old woman, Philemon, the old man, already up scurrying around making a morning meal for them before they went on their way. And they were seated around the table now. And this older traveler, he took his bowl of milk there, and he drank. He said, why, this is delicious, so sweet, so cold. May I have a little more? And Baucis was embarrassed, and she said, I'm sorry, but that pitcher is empty. And the goat has sold, and there is no more. And with that, this man stood up, and he took the pitcher in his hand. And he said, you know, it's so easy to prepare for the coming of kings. My God, they announce themselves wherever they go, don't they? We gods, we never do. And they looked up to see these tattered robes become these shimmering gowns shot through with threads of pure gold. And this traveler said, I am Zeus. This is my son Hermes. And I will tell you, long have we traveled this weary earth, and never have we known hospitality as sweet, as kind, and as good as yours. And I tell you this right now, from this day forward, this pitcher will always be full. And from the empty pitcher, Zeus himself now poured a full bowl of milk for Baucis and for Philemon and for Hermes for himself. And of course the pitcher brimmed full again. When they finished their meal, he said, now come with me. And they walked out the door, across the road, up onto a rise, and they were just looking out at the beauty of the day. But when they turned back, Baucis said, Philemon, look. The old man looked down to see that his little hut was gone. But where it had stood, there was a beautiful little alabaster temple with two great cedar trees growing on either side. And Zeus said, this is your home now. And I promise you will always have whatever it is that you need. You will always live free from want. But tell me, is there anything that you might desire? And Philemon, he got down on his knees. He said, my desire is to care for this temple in your honor. And Baucis said, there is one thing. My husband and I, we've lived together in love for so many, many, many years. I don't believe I could bear to look upon his grave. My desire would be that we never have to say farewell. And Hermes said, but you are mortals. You must die someday. And Zeus said, Hermes, and we are gods. And we will find a way to honor the request of these, our friends. They bid farewell to Baucis and Philemon. They went on their way. And the elderly couple lived in that house for many, many, many years, always extending hospitality to whoever came by, and every evening walking in the hills behind the temple. But one day as they were doing that, they were very old. And as Baucis walked home, she began to feel her feet growing heavy. And then finally she couldn't even move them. And she looked down and she said, Philemon, look. It was the bark of a linden tree growing over her legs. And her feet were sprouting roots. And the old man was looking at his hands. His fingers were becoming twigs and unfurling oak leaves. It was their time to die, but instead the gods were making of her a beautiful linden and him a stately oak. There was only enough time to reach out, and their hands intertwined. And he said, Baucis, my love. And she said, Philemon, my husband. And their hands intertwined in that place. And the Greeks say to this day, in that place, the temple of Baucis and Philemon, that has long ago disappeared. But the two trees, they yet remain, still intertwined in love as the boughs of a linden and an oak. To this day, the birds, the animals favor that place. They say many travelers have spent the night beneath the boughs of those trees. And people tell me that many, many, many stories have been told there. And I know for a fact all of those stories, just like all of mine, finally do come to an end, you know. And the way the great Ovid poet finished his story was to say, those who love are always loved throughout time. Those who have cherished others, we cherish to this day. So it was for Baucis and Philemon, but so may it be for all of us. And that's the story by the great Roman poet Ovid, Baucis and Philemon. Thank you. Mark, I can't let them leave with a story that heavy, so I'm going to give you a 2-minute tale to leave on. Is that okay? All right, good. First off, I want to say there's an old saying in Ireland that a story is a seed. It's just a seed. But if it finds good ground, in a willing ear, an open heart, it'll root, shoot, flower, and fruit in front of our eyes. And so I want to thank you for being such a wonderful and generous audience, being the earth to these stories, and for helping me bring them to life. Because I always think at storytelling, what we've done, we do together. So give yourselves a hand for being such a great audience. All right, last tale. In Ireland, there's a saying that a writer is a failed conversationalist. And here's a story called The Failed Conversation. It was Pat McCarthy and Mike Flaherty. They were farmers. They had adjoining farms. They always helped each other out. But Pat went to Dublin to care for his uncle for 4 months who was ailing. But while he was gone, Mike watched after his farm. And so he finally came home by rail, and Mike went to the railway station to greet him. And now the two men were riding by buggy, it was in the old days, from the railway station, all the long ride back to Pat's farm. When Pat, of course, turned to Mike and said, Mike, these months that I've been gone now, what's the news? And Mike said, well, there hasn't been any news. Well, I've been gone for 4 months. Certainly something must have happened. No, nothing. Well, not since your dog died, anyway. Says, oh, geez, the dog died. Well, how'd the dog die? Well, I'm not certain, but I would assume it was all the burnt horse flesh he ate. I think it poisoned him, and in that way he died. Well, Mike, where would my dog be getting a hold of burnt horse flesh? That probably was after the barn burned down, I guess. And he was, my barn burned down? Oh, clean to the stones. You could see it for miles. Says, Jesus, Mike, how did the barn burn down? Well, I'm not certain. I'm assuming it would be sparks from the house. It was a windy night that night, you see. Says, wait, the house? The house was on fire? Oh, it was. It's not any longer. It burned to the ground right along with the barn. You could see it for miles, too. Says, Jesus, the house is burned down? Well, Mike, how did that happen? Now, that I can tell you. In fact, I was warning him all that night. I said, you shouldn't be lighting all these candles in a wood frame house. It's dangerous. Oh, but they said, Mike, you have to have candles at a wake. It's customary, you know, you put them around the coffin, you see. Well, they tipped over and cut, wait, a coffin? Someone died? Well, I'm afraid this was your poor mother-in-law that took sick and died. Nothing could have killed her. How did she die? Well, I'm not certain, Pat, but I'm assuming it was a heart attack. I think just the shock of seeing your wife run off with that young priest, that Father Kelly. I never trusted him. Says my wife run off with a priest? My mother-in-law's dead? My house is burned to the ground, the barn horses is killed. You say there hasn't been any news. Well, like I said, Pat, not since the dog died. Yep. Thank you very much.